Galactic Coalition Grand Archive Collection, Final Days of the Simgal Species, Sapience of Planet X Chiron, Audio Log Transcription. The screen fizzles as a fox-like alien appears, her fur stood on end. Hello, beloved listeners. My name is Zima. I am a news broadcaster for the Zorathan government. Her lips quiver as she continues. As you all know by now, 387 galactic days ago, a meteorite touched down on our planet's surface, within the Emeth Nation's Shawali National Park. The following winter morning, 13 galactic hours later, 7 Emeth scientists struck out into the forest to find this meteorite. They, like all of us, had no idea what this interstellar object brought with it. An organism now understood to be extraplanetary in origin attacked and overwhelmed the researchers. The recording of head scientist Rekish being eaten alive by the entity still reverberates around the world today as one of the creature's first victims. An image of the scientist appears on screen, followed by sounds of agonized screaming. Attempts by the Planetary Biohazard Commission to contain this entity failed, and within a week it had consumed the entire park. By the time the Emeth military was authorized to respond, it was too late. None of their weapons proved effective against the organism, and they too were consumed as it began expanding past the park and into nearby cities. As of now, the creature has consumed an estimated 99.7% of the planet's macrocellular biomass. Nuclear ordnance has proven only marginally effective in slowing its advance. Gehishar, the city from which I now broadcast, is one of only 3 remaining holdouts for our species. Our population, once numbering in the billions, has been reduced to a few thousand. I'm sure most of this information is known by listeners. Tomorrow, what remains of our planet's military will be making a desperate final push against the encroaching threat. Their objective is an abandoned research facility where previously scientists were working on a cure for this planetary plague. They were less than halfway finished when the entity overwhelmed them. If by some miracle the military successfully reaches the facility and manufactures a counteragent, then this broadcast will be looked back on with triumph. Otherwise, it will be remembered as our species' final dying whimper. One way or another, let this broadcast be a warning to any species on any planet that receives this message. I've sent footage of the organism's conquest of our planet so that its danger cannot be underestimated. Thank you all for listening in, and may fires of our will ever burn bright. 3 days later, this broadcast was sent out in a Simgal military code. HFYISNOCURE, August 17, 2025. That day began as any other did. The first group of researchers arrived just as the 6th was preparing to take their leave. Gathering initial measurements and setting up devices for use in whatever experiment they were planning, the first group quickly began their set of tests. Experiment 015, began the round one, retrieving a lensed black box thicker than the glowing rectangle he liked to look at, and mounting it upon 3 poles not far from my cage. Intelligence Test 1. As soon as the round one finished talking, the deep one stepped beside my container and continued on his behalf. The organism has shown truly remarkable intelligence. It is capable of recognizing symbolic gestures in a similar manner to dogs, and as such we suspect its cognitive abilities to be at least on par with canines. Reaching into the storage flap of his white coat, the deep one produced from within a strange cube. On each face, it bore 9 squares of the same color, with a different color for each face. This experiment was recommended to me by Jane Stern, a xenobiology student currently working towards her PhD. Leaning down to face me directly, the deep one held out the strange cube in front of me and began pointing at the 6 colored faces before gesturing towards my food bag, now held within the tall one's tendrils. Then, wrapping his other hand around the top of this cube, he twisted it horizontally, misaligning the top squares. Then, after twisting it once more vertically, he opened the latch to my cage and dropped in the object. Curiosity propelled me forth as I wrapped my tendrils around the device. Whenever they pointed at the bag, it meant that I would be fed pending their trial. Given how emphatically the deep one had pointed toward the uniform faces, I presumed that he wanted me to return this cube to such a state. Carefully twisting the segments it had undone back into place, I took stock of my work to ensure the cube looked just as the creature wanted it, before shoving it forth against the latch of my cage. As anticipated, the deep one was quick to reward my work, taking back the cube and in turn placing a flesh lump into my habitat, presumably as a reward for my endeavor. Then the deep one turned their back to me and once again began fidgeting with the odd cube. As they did this, I looked upon my newfound snack at first with the usual hunger, but then with something else entirely. For whatever reason, I found myself inexplicably overwhelmed with curiosity. I had eaten so many of these dead creatures, and yet I never bothered to truly understand them. Gently prying open the dead organism's maw and snaking one of my tendrils into it, I allowed my biomass to fill up the empty space within, providing me with a basic sensory map of its inner workings. Almost immediately, I noticed something strange. Whereas the inside of my body bore a largely uniform structure, this one was totally discordant. Why are the cells lumped up like that? Naturally, I had to know more. Reaching inside with more of my biomass, I carefully split open the flesh of its torso, and beneath that uniform facade, found something truly bizarre. For the most part, my own cells bore little need to specialize. Each and every one of them could in theory operate as an independent organism. The only part of me composed of function-dedicated cells was my one self-developed eye, and even those could easily be repurposed should the need arise. This creature was different. Oddly shaped hunks of flesh resided within like a colony of entirely different entities. Morbid fascination overcame my unease as I wrapped my tendril around one of these lumps and yanked it free from between the rigid white cage keeping it inside. Now we're going to see if it can solve a more complex... The deep one began speaking before quickly cutting out. At that moment, however, I was far too absorbed in my personal task to pay him any mind. Carefully, I began to disassemble the part in search of answers. Each and every cell I encountered within this lump looked as though it had been horrifically mutilated. Though their varied structures spoke to differing tasks, none of them bore the mechanisms needed to behave independently. Unlike the ones within my eye, these cells lacked the flexibility to alter their task. Perhaps even more disturbing than this, however, was their total lack of neuron structures. Each of these things operated less like living beings and more as mindless machines, lobotomized slaves serving as single-use tools. "What's it doing?" said the tall one, casting an expectant gaze towards the deep one. Finishing off my work with the first piece, I digested it before setting to work on the next. A long rope folded repeatedly atop itself. "Looks like it's tearing it apart for fun," growled the squeaky one. With each piece I investigated, I discovered small trails of slightly less freakish cells. These ones at least bore sensory structures. Then it came to me. Sensory structures were useless without neurons to respond. Wherever these trails led was where I would find the final piece to this puzzle. "No," hummed the deep one, leaning in to get a better look at my work. "It's dissecting it. It's doing research." Following the trails of sensory tissue, I eventually found myself digging into the creature's head. Inside, I discovered something I could only have described as utterly alien. This piece wasn't like the others. Though not alive at that moment, I could tell that these cells had been the thinking ones. They too, however, were limited. They could not move. They could not eat. They could only think. These were the masters of this biological hierarchy, piloting the body like some kind of device forged from flesh. Are they all like this? I wondered, suddenly looking back at the researchers with newfound discomfort. Even the soft one? I wasn't sure what to think. Thoughtless flesh puppeted about by an immobile network of neurons. For a moment I pondered whether or not they were even alive in the same way that I was. "Jason, we will return to this later," droned the deep one, looking upon me with a newfound intensity that I did not like. "For now, ready experiment number 021. The soft one arrived just in time to see the others approaching me with a smaller cage, housing something that at first I did not recognize. This creature was small, perhaps half my size. Most of its body, save for the tail, was covered in white fur not unlike that on the top of the researchers' heads. "What are you guys doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with what sounded like concern. "We want to test how it reacts to an unknown living organism," replied the deep one, placing the smaller cage beside mine and firmly picking up the creature within. "This experiment has a variety of implications. For one thing, it could tell us what ecological niche Samael fulfills where he comes from." "Are you sure it won't hurt Samael?" replied the soft one, approaching my cage and placing her hand against the glass. Despite whatever she said having been directed at the deep one, it did not answer her as it set the fluffy creature into my cage. The organism's pure black eyes locked onto me as it near immediately backed itself into a corner. Curiously, I slithered closer, spreading out my mass to keep the creature cornered as it squeaked erratically. Upon closer inspection, its features were familiar. This was a larger version of the pink lumps they fed to me. Perhaps the smaller ones were juveniles. Reaching out to the organism with a tentative tendril, I pondered what its fate would be. Evidently, it wasn't friendly, as upon my reaching out, its head lunged forward with the intent to bite. With that, I came to the reluctant conclusion that this too was meant to be food. Hesitance buffered my movements as I encroached upon the animal and lashed out, wrapping my tendrils around its limbs to prevent it from wiggling around. Nothing but empty flesh, I thought to myself, inching closer in preparation to consume it. Around me, the researchers fell silent. Within their eyes, I recognized the same primal fear displayed by my struggling prey. Deep within me, I felt a spark of familiarity in what I was doing. It was as though I had done it 1,000,000 times before. This thing was not like me. It was but a freakish collection of life unliving, just a device forged from flesh, something to nourish a superior life form. But shifting my eye to face the soft one, I saw that same dread on her face as the others displayed. She was terrified of what I was about to do. No! I concluded to myself, halting my advance upon the helpless creature. It is alive. Like me, like her. Thinking back to my experiment, I had only been considering the individual pieces of the organism. Perhaps, however, this unorthodox life was more than the sum of its parts. Though they were different from me, I was not prepared to take a life, least of all in front of the soft one. My tendrils slackened as I let go of the creature, returning to the soft one's side of the tank and pressing myself against it. Interesting. I thought for sure Samael was going to eat it, murmured the deep one, writing down notes on my behavior as the white-furred creature clawed desperately at the wall of my cage in hopes to get away from me. I did not blame it. Why did it behave that way? Maybe it's territorial and was trying to scare the rat off? Proposed the squeaky one, their former fear giving way to curiosity. Carefully unlatching the cage and reaching inside, they collected the fuzzy thing and returned it to its cage, dropping in an unfamiliar red foodstuff before taking the container away. "Professor?" began the soft one, refusing to take her eyes off of me as she spoke. "I have a hypothesis. It's a bit out there, though." Looking at the soft one curiously, the deep one replied, "Those are often the best ones. Go ahead and enlighten us." Samael seems to have gotten smarter the more he's grown, and don't know how big these things can get, right? She asked, her comforting gaze moving away from me and landing on the deep one. What if we're dealing with the juvenile variant of a sapient species? "Okay, Jane, now you've lost it," interjected the squeaky one, with the tall and round ones both vocalizing what I presumed to be agreement. "It is most certainly avant-garde," continued the deep one, contemplatively rubbing his facial fur. "We would need more data to confirm or deny, but I can most certainly see where your hypothesis is coming from." Following a brief jiggling of the handle, loud, repetitive knocks sounded against the lab door, prompting the immediate attention of each researcher as the deep one went investigate. "Dr. Morick!" shouted the unfamiliar voice loud enough to be vaguely heard even through the thick metal door. "Open up!" Approaching the door with hesitant steps, the deep one wrapped his fingers around the handle and pulled it open to reveal on the other side 5 creatures. 4 of them bore suits made of white, shiny material, with clear screens over their faces. The 5th, who stood in front, wore a simple black jacket with a red tie. "Who might you be?" began the deep one, regarding this one with clear suspicion. "My name is Director Voss," the suited one replied, shoving past the deep one alongside its plastic-clad compatriots. "We are here to confiscate the alien organism housed within this facility, on behalf of the U.S. government." "You can't just do that! Where's the paperwork authorizing this?" shouted the squeaky one, startling those beside him as he stepped forth towards the figure, only to stop dead in his tracks as the suited one produced a sleek black device mounted beside his lower torso, and with it pointed towards him. "Got your paperwork right here," the suited one replied, its voice utterly devoid of emotional inflection, as their cohorts began rounding up the equipment used to study me. "Consider yourselves lucky we're not throwing the book at you for withholding valuable intel." Distress flared in the soft one's eyes, as one of the shiny ones ripped from her hands the white sheets she had been using to take notes. "How do we know you're actually working for the government? What's your department?" "You haven't heard of us." "Trust me," replied the suited one with a ghastly grin, stepping closer to my tank and peering inside with a predatory glare. "If you must know, though, we're with DESTA, the Department of Extraterrestrial Study and Threat Assessment." Frantically watching as the shiny ones confiscated their equipment, the deep one approached the suited one and spoke to him in a low growl. "The university was given express permission," To study a meteorite, interjected the suited one, retrieving a pair of blue gloves before picking up the dish that contained my severed tendril. Not an alien organism. How long were you planning to hide this from us, Professor? We wanted a thorough analysis before we unveiled our findings to the public. The public? Scoffed the suited one, handing off my tendril to one of the shiny ones before again locking eyes with the deep one. They're not going to know about this. This is too important to risk interference by ignorant morons and grubby politicians. Rubbing his fingers together to produce a snapping sound, the suited one watched coldly as what I presumed to be his underlings approached the researchers and grabbed them. I thought you said we wouldn't be tried, hissed the squeaky one, briefly struggling against the grip of a shiny one before seemingly surrendering himself. Were you lying, or just planning to put a bullet in us instead? Don't be melodramatic, chuckled the suited one, finally holstering his black device. You've been interacting with an alien organism. We don't know what kind of pathogens it could be carrying, so we're placing you all under protective quarantine. Let go! You're hurting me! Cried the soft one as one of the shiny ones grabbed her and pinned her hands behind her back, before affixing them there with a metal chain attached to 2 circles that went around her wrists. Fear and fury flooded my thoughts as I rammed myself against my prison, desperately laboring to break through. Perhaps I could not have done anything with my size, but that did not mean I wasn't going to try. Nevertheless, my cage remained intact as the soft one and others were herded out of the lab. Load everything up into the truck, barked the suited one, peering directly at me. You little guy are going to put us back on top. I did not know their intentions. I did not know why they were taking things. I did not know why they hurt the soft one. So many things I did not know, but I knew one thing for certain. I did not like the ones in suits. August 25th, 2025. Compared to the new location I was brought to by the suited ones, my previous situation had been paradise. The new tank was smaller than its predecessor and with far thicker walls to keep me in. Bulky instruments hummed and blinked against otherwise blank white walls, their likely grim purposes largely unbeknownst to me. As was the case with the soft one and her compatriots, I was at no point left alone within this lab. Whereas previously that had been a comfort, here it was continuous agony. Most of the suited one's experiments felt more like acts of creative torture than genuine inquiry. Despite my persistent suffering, I nevertheless resolved to learn as much as I could about the suited ones. Hopefully, they would provide me with some information that might be useful for getting back to the soft one. Research Director Log 07, began one of the suited ones. Judging by its differently colored yellow getup and how the white suited ones deferred to it, I presumed this individual to be above them in the facility's social hierarchy. The organism designated as ET1 displays truly remarkable durability and adaptability far outpacing Earth-based life. Its unstable, glucose-based genome enables rapid replication and a capacity for what can only be described as individual evolution. Meanwhile, as the yellow one spoke, its underlings approached my cage and began turning the knobs on a panel in front of it. Fear flooded my system alongside recognition, reflexively curling my tendrils into myself in preparation for more pain. Each time they inflicted upon me something unpleasant, it was shortly after interacting with that panel. My working hypothesis was that it somehow controlled these conditions, but I had no way of confirming that. So far, continued Yellow Suit, approaching my enclosure with a casual stride, the organism has shown to effectively operate in extreme temperatures ranging from -206 to 115 degrees Celsius. It survived and adapted to total submersion in concentrated sulfuric acid, and it demonstrates remarkable resistance or even outright immunity to every chemical weapon ever used on a battlefield, including the synthetic VX nerve toxin. Finally coming to a stop directly in front of me, I could feel the scrutiny of Yellow Suit's gaze even beneath its uniquely black-tinted mask. Today's experiment will focus on ET1's resistance to pressure. Right now, the testing chamber is set to 1 atmosphere of pressure. Gentlemen, start cranking it up. Following a few seconds of activity pressing buttons and flipping switches, the other suited ones took a step back and began watching me intently. At first I felt nothing. There was no splash of caustic fluid, no drastic increase or reduction in temperature, not even a harmless puff of gas. For a few moments, I thought perhaps something had broken, and I was safe for the time being. Then, however, I began to notice a tiny difference in how the air itself pressed against me. 4 atmospheres, equivalent pressure to recreational scuba diving limit, murmured the yellow one. Keep going. At first, the difference was entirely negligible. I barely felt anything. 10 atmospheres, approaching the technical diver limit. This continued for quite some time. I'd feel next to nothing, and yet the suited ones reacted with fascination. 100 atmospheres, pressure at submarine depth. Slowly but surely, that strange feeling began to magnify from barely noticeable to mildly irritating. 224 atmospheres, approaching maximum sperm whale dive pressure. Soon enough, my surface began to ripple of its own volition in response to this ever-magnifying force. It felt like my whole body was being pushed in on itself. 500 atmospheres, 600, 700. It was around that time that I started to really feel the pain, as though an invisible beast had taken hold of me within its jaws and was just now beginning to bite down. 1100 atmospheres, Mariana Trench depth. What started as a light discomfort soon became an agony that lanced through my system as I struggled to maintain form amidst the onslaught. My body's adaptation prevented me from being completely crushed, and yet the pain remained relatively constant. 2000 atmospheres, 2200, 2400. For what must have been the 6th time since arriving at the facility, I thought for sure I was going to die. My adaptation could not keep pace with this torment for very long, and eventually I felt myself beginning to break down, my functions grinding to a halt as I laid there in insurmountable pain. "Entity falling dormant at 3,186 atmospheres," said the one in the yellow suit, their posture unburdened by regret for its actions or compassion for my suffering. "Begin normalizing pressure." At last, the crushing sensation began to subside, leaving me as little more than a puddle on the floor of my tank. Instantly, my cells began to repair themselves of the damage, using those that were too far gone to function as nourishment for more salvageable ones. As I once again began to move, twinges of surprise flickered across the faces of a few researchers, before quickly fading back into cold dispassion. Suddenly, the black brick mounted upon the yellow one's chest rang to life as it spoke out in the voice of the black-jacketed one. "Tage, this is Director Voss, requesting clearance to come inspect your work." By this point, I was relatively sure that the boxes served as some kind of long-range communication. Usually, when the jacketed one's voice came on, it meant that they would soon arrive in person to speak with Yellow Suit. Reaching for the device and pressing down on some kind of switch, the yellow one spoke out in reply, "Permission granted, sir." Then, taking its finger off the switch, Yellow Suit turned to its underlings and spoke out, "Smith, supply the organism with 3 cubes of dried nutrient broth. We'll continue testing after the director has a look." Though the nutrient cubes were paltry compared to what I had been fed at the old lab, I nevertheless could hardly contain my excitement as one of the suited ones reached into a nearby cabinet and produced from it the bag containing them. I had only been fed twice before since arriving at this dreadful place, and those were by far the highlights of my captivity. Plucking 3 cubes of bland nutrition from the bag, the one designated to feed me hovered their hand's short, chubby finger over a red button and pressed down upon it to open my cage's external door. Unlike my previous living situation, where the only thing separating me from the lab itself was a single manual latch, this container was structured almost like an airlock, with 2 mechanically sealed doors ever stood between myself and freedom. Placing my nutrient cubes into the space between these doors, the suited one again pressed the red button, resealing the outer door before flipping a small switch and pressing a blue button to open the inner one. Snatching up the cubes and retreating to the far end of my enclosure to consume them in relative peace, I watched as Yellow Suit approached the lab door. As per my prediction regarding those black boxes, the entrance barrier slid open to reveal the jacketed one. "Hello, Doctor. I trust you and your men are making progress in your research." "Indeed, sir," replied the yellow one, guiding Black Jacket across the lab over to a desk containing white sheet stacks, a small single-lensed instrument, and the sample of my severed tendril taken what felt like ages ago. ET-1 is well and truly a biological marvel beyond our wildest predictions. It redefines everything we know about life itself. Reaching down onto the desk with his spindly fingers, Black Jacket picked up the dish containing my sample. "I'm not here for platitudes, Tage," he chuckled, approaching my enclosure and setting down beside it the tendril dish. "I'm here for results." "Of course, sir," Yellow Suit stammered, gesturing for the other suited ones to take their leave as it too approached my cage. The organism's resistance to pressure is even greater than we had anticipated. It remained active at nearly 3 times the pressure found in the deepest point of Earth's oceans. Hearing that, the one in the black jacket curled its lips up at me, unveiling the unnervingly white protrusions normally nestled beneath. One tough bastard, then. Good, it remarked before turning back to face the yellow one. What are the potential applications? Applications? Repeated Yellow Suit, pausing for a long moment to fidget with its gloved hands. Well, the way its cells operate is completely novel and frankly more effective than ours. If we could somehow enhance human stem cells to behave like those of ET1, then the medical implications are staggering. Immortality, an end to all disease, all sorts of— Spare me your idealism, interrupted Black Jacket, their tone somehow colder than anything I'd experienced within the torture box. What does this mean for our military? Something in what the one with the black jacket had said evidently struck some kind soft spot on Yellow Suit, as immediately their demeanor shifted. With all due respect, Voss, we have no idea what this thing is capable of. I cannot in good conscience help you turn it into a weapon. If you're interested in keeping your job, I'd urge you to reconsider, hissed Black Jacket. Because right now, we have the opportunity to deal Uncle Sam a full deck for the first time since the Manhattan Project. And if we play our cards right, China and Russia will be playing catch-up for the next 3 decades at least. I'll try to come up with something, sir, sighed Yellow Suit, the authority in their posture crumbling away into meek submission as they spoke. Attaboy, grinned the one with the black jacket, slapping Yellow Suit twice on the back before approaching the laboratory door and signaling with their hand for the other to follow. Now then, let's say we go grab us a drink to celebrate all the men and women in uniform whose lives you're going to save with this thing. But sir, it's barely past noon. 5:00 somewhere, shrugged Black Jacket, exiting the laboratory, followed shortly thereafter by the one in the yellow suit, who then sealed the door shut behind them. For the first time since arriving at this awful place, I was completely and totally alone, unsure of how long this period of merciful solitude might last, or of whether or not I'd ever get another. I quickly came to the conclusion that this could be my one and only chance. Reeling back my full biomass, I slammed into the inner door with all my might, in hopes to force it open. Again and again and again my body collided against the clear barrier with reckless abandon before reeling back to the far wall, in preparation to do it again. No matter how desperately I labored to free myself, however, the barrier simply refused to give way. Not strong enough, I thought to myself before slamming into the inner door with enough force to severely damage my own cells. Outside of the cage, my tendril curled in response to the pain, as though it were still attached to me. Putting my onslaught on hold to look upon the wriggling reminder of the soft one, my cells suddenly surged with newfound inspiration. Pressing myself against the invisible barrier as close to my disconnected limb as possible, I concentrated strongly upon the phantom sensation which I had by then become so accustomed to that it barely registered at all. Every little piece of me called out in desperation to the tendril, which had by then returned to a motionless state. My neurons felt like they might catch fire, yet still I maintained focus. At long last, after what felt like an eternity of sheer concentration, the tendril began to twitch. At first, the moment was so subtle I could barely register it, yet slowly but surely it intensified until the dish containing it began to quiver. Willing my lost appendage into obedience, I watched as it jutted up like a spike from its resting place, popping off the dish lid that had been covering it. Inch by inch my tendril slithered forth through concentrated will, eventually managing to reach the control panel of my cage. Which button do I press? Hovering over the controls, I thought back to earlier when that suited one opened my enclosure's inner hatch. Scanning the control panel beneath me, my sights quickly fell upon a familiar blue button. Navigating my tendril over to it and pressing down, hope and relief surged through my body as the inner door unsealed, allowing me to crawl into the space between. Such joy, however, was quickly replaced by pure panic when the red button next to it refused to give way. Terror flooded my system as I began to imagine what sort of punishments might await me should I be caught. If these creatures were willing to torture me, as they had for simply existing, then I dreaded to imagine what they would do if they discovered me attempting an escape. As I laid there anticipating defeat, my thoughts returned, as they so often did, to the soft one. I could still hear her distressed cries from when the suited ones took her away. No, This does not end here. I will return to the soft one. I will punish those who have harmed us. With my focus renewed, I looked upon the control panel and thought back carefully to when it had last been operated. Just above the two buttons was a single small switch. That's it! Commanding my tendril to reach up and flip it before then returning to the red button, at last I was triumphant. The outer door, the final thing keeping me within my prison, slid aside and allowed me through. Of course, this was only the first leg of my grand escape. I did not know how many individuals stood between myself and true freedom, but what was clear to me was that I was starving. Fortunately, the suited one that had fed me neglected to put away the bag, instead leaving it beside my cage. Tearing open the container and greedily snatching up the dozen or so cubes still inside, I took them into myself and began to digest. Unfortunately, this added biomass would not be nearly enough for me to fight my way out. I would have to escape using stealth. Even more unfortunately, that plan was dashed in an instant as the lab door once again slid open to reveal one of the white-suited ones, now staring directly at me.